Alberta Premier Daniel Smith and the UCP have been demanding an apology from the NDP and leader Rachel Notley, and it has something to do with Bill 1, or the Alberta Sovereignty within the United Canada Act. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, why is the UCP wanting Notley to say she's sorry?
Well, this sort of dates back to the immediate aftermath of the bill being introduced. Bill 1, the very first bill that the UCP has introduced. And she seemed to sort of suggest that the federal government should intervene in some way and quash or veto the legislation, which is sort of this residual power that, the federal government could do it, probably won't. And Notley's kind of backtracked on it. And so they've taken another tack on attacking the bill, saying that it'll harm investment and this is a sideshow distracting from other issues and things like that. But it does put the UCP in the position, as you noted, of demanding this apology for Notley's response to the, what did you say off the top? The Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act, which is a bit of a mouthful for all of us here.
Now, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's kind of taking a wait-and-see approach when it comes to the Alberta Sovereignty Act. What does this actually look like? And will the province and maybe the Trudeau Liberals end up in court?
Well, that's a good question, and we don't know just yet. It seems like the purpose of the act, to some extent, is to provoke the Trudeau government into taking Alberta to court and say, no, you actually have to do this or enforce this or follow this rule. But at the time being, they've said basically that they don't want to take any options off the table, but they're going to give it a wait-and-see approach. Of course, there are likely to be amendments to this. There are, it could fail. It's unlikely, but it could fail. And it might not even be used in sort of any substantive way for several months yet. So they're sort of keeping their powder dry. But you can imagine a situation in which Trudeau would love to have this fight, would love to scrap with the province over this. So I think we'll have to, I'm sure they are sitting in their strategy meetings in Ottawa, gaming out exactly how they could benefit from this.
And I could see political pundits saying that this would shore up support for both the UCP and Daniel Smith, their supporters, and as well for the Trudeau Liberals. What do you think?
I think that's true. The polling does not suggest sort of wild enthusiasm across Alberta for the idea of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. It's sort of a strange situation, right? Because you have sort of general discontent in the province about the way Ottawa has treated Alberta. You have had sort of periods of quite high alienation in the past few years, but that doesn't seem to totally be translating into like massive support for something like the Sovereignty Act. Obviously the support is very, very high among United Conservative Party supporters. It's a little bit less high among sort of Albertans as a whole, particularly in Edmonton, to a lesser extent in Calgary, and, it's most popular obviously in rural and small town Alberta. So it's going to be an interesting gambit, I think, to see how they sort of do what the party's base asked, while also not, sort of ticking off other voters who they need to vote for them in May.
Tyler, now the UCP actually brought forth some amendments in regards to Bill 1, the Alberta Sovereignty Act. What do they actually look like?
Well, they have to do with this what ended up being quite a controversial part of the legislation. When it was first announced, it basically was going to give Cabinet the power to unilaterally amend legislation. So what that would have looked like was, if the Alberta Sovereignty Act is invoked, if a motion is brought to the legislature, if recommendations for legislative change are made to Cabinet, Cabinet could then unilaterally go and change that legislation. That was really controversial. And that seems to be one of the things that the Smith government is walking back. They are now saying, no, there's going to have to be legislative debate on any changes to legislation. So that was sort of the big thing that is likely to change here. The other thing is that the bill sort of generally and vaguely, frankly, spoke about harms to Albertans. So the Alberta Sovereignty Act could be invoked in cases where there were harms to Albertans or Alberta's interests. But of course, what constitutes a harm? And so the bill is now likely to be amended to reflect more precisely what that means, such as violating charter rights of Albertans or, economic interests, things like that. So those, I think, are probably the two big amendments that we're likely to see that sort of came from, fairly sustained opposition from the official opposition, and also, quite a bit of feedback, I think, from Albertans to MLA's offices and things like that. So, I think we can probably fairly say that the process is sort of working as intended, although it's hard not to. I mean, a lot of critics are saying, no, this is a big setback for Danielle Smith. This she's taking a climb down on this. Her first bill, she's having to backtrack these things. So, that's sort of what the pundits are saying. Does that reflect what regular people are saying? Of course, is a totally different question.
Now, a number of Alberta's treaty chiefs say they're actually united in their opposition to Bill 1, the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Tyler, now the government has promised consultations with them. Shouldn't this have happened prior to introducing Bill 1?
Well, that is a confusing thing. This seems like an obvious sort of place where the province would have thought, oh gosh, we need to consult with these groups. Because, of course, treaties are signed with the federal government. They're not signed with the provincial government. So the treaty chiefs are saying, this sort of tramples all over our sovereignty, our rights as communities. And so the Smith government has promised consultations, but so far there's no real sign of softening among the Treaty 6 chiefs, Treaty 6, 7, 8 chiefs, I think, all together. And they are in Ottawa this week talking about this at the Assembly of First Nations gathering. And incidentally, their sort of Saskatchewan compatriots are saying the same thing about Saskatchewan's Saskatchewan First Act, which is similar, although not quite as extensive as the Sovereignty Act. So this, I think, is going to be a sustained sort of other side of this story beyond the political maneuverings. There is this sort of genuinely real question about how Indigenous people in Alberta are going to respond to this and how it will affect them.
Jason Kenney resigned his seat at the legislature. Now, do we know what's next for the former Alberta Premier? Is he headed back to Ontario?
We don't. I asked for an interview and I haven't got it yet. But it wasn't unexpected. I don't think that he would maybe leave politics after 25 years. It was perhaps a little bit unexpected that it happened sort of right as Smith was really revving up the engines on the first day back. But he sort of signed off with a lament for the state of politics, that he's worried about polarization to both the left and the right. Not a new statement from him, of course. He had been very outspoken against some of the more conservative elements within the United Conservative Party. But at this point, we don't know what he's doing next. I'm hoping to find out. But you have to think that maybe he's going to go lay on a beach somewhere for a bit after 25 years of nonstop work.
I know I would, absolutely. Somewhere warmer.
Yeah, exactly.
Tyler, the province announced a new deal with the Alberta Medical Association, and among other things, it means the potential for more rural physicians here in the province?
Yeah, I mean, this has been sort of part of the talk on fixing the healthcare system for a long, long time, trying to encourage more doctors to go to rural areas. There was this plan floated a couple of years ago where they were going to sort of force medical school residents to go where they told them to, sort of like the RCMP does. And of course, there were ugly contract negotiations for quite some time between Alberta's doctors and Alberta Health Services. Now, the thing that I would point out that is really interesting about this is there's been a change to a change. A couple of years ago, the Alberta government basically gave itself the power to unilaterally scrap the agreement between doctors and the province. And they are now, it appears, giving up that power as part of these sort of negotiations to try and, I think, sort of smooth over the relationship between physicians and the province. So big developments there. Of course, this is also happening at the same time as Danielle Smith has this doctor looking into, sort of wide-ranging reforms on the health system. So there's actually a lot happening on the medical front at the moment, and it sort of remains to be seen how quickly we're going to see changes sort of on the front lines, I think.
And the bottom line is we need more doctors in so many centres, including here in Lethbridge, such a shortage of doctors. Tyler, the UCP announced that 5 million bottles of children's Tylenol, acetaminophen, ibuprofen are coming to help shore up a shortage of kids' medication. And it's good timing since cold and flu season has begun.
Great timing, yeah. I mean, there's not that many parents in my life, but parents of young kids, I should say. But certainly this is a thing that's all over social media, parents sort of desperately looking for these sort of pain and fever medications for their kids. And it looks like Alberta is in negotiations with a Turkish company that produces the sort of constituent ingredients, I guess you could say, of medication. And they're hoping that these 5 million bottles will arrive within the next sort of few weeks here. Now, there is a hiccup, which is, of course, that Health Canada regulates the import of medications, and there's bilingual labeling requirements. So it remains to be seen how easily those wrinkles will be smoothed over, but certainly it does suggest that the Alberta government is moving, rather quickly on this file that is on a lot of people's minds right now.
Now, still with healthcare, the NDP has been hammering the government over the state of Alberta's hospitals. An example is a hospice for terminally ill kids in Calgary had to discharge patients so that staff could be redeployed. What's the latest from our Health Minister, Jason Copping?
Well, the latest is basically that they think that things are going to start getting better, that sort of the infection numbers of fever and RSV, which a respiratory virus that kids get, are starting to trend downwards. So hopefully the pressures will begin to ease. There's been a number of surgeries canceled. There's at the Calgary Children's Hospital, the Alberta Children's Hospital, I think it's technically called, they brought out a heated sort of ATCO trailer kind of thing to serve as a backup waiting area for the emergency. So a pretty dire state. And what we haven't heard is something like mask mandates. Of course, the government has said flat out, those sorts of things aren't coming back. But the health minister has essentially said that he thinks things are going to get better, and there's been staff redeployments, as you mentioned, to try and manage some of this. But still, I think, a pretty scary situation for parents of children.
Tyler, for the time being, adding the rights of the unvaccinated to the Human Rights Act has been shelved. Do we know why?
We sort of do. Danielle Smith has been asked about it, and she basically said that, look, this one change is not going to solve the problem. So not entirely certain what that means in terms of what other actions could be taken, but it doesn't seem like we're going to see legislation on that, in the immediate future. Could that come in the spring? Could that come as maybe a platform promise in the election? I think that's a possibility. But if people were hoping, for sort of immediate action on that, it doesn't seem like it's going to be happening.
Here's kind of an interesting story. Justice reforms plan to give weapons to the security team at the legislature. Now, Tyler, there are items in the justice reform as well, including making it easier to collect both spousal and child support. Tell me more.
Right. So some of the guards at the legislature are not armed, but there was a suicide at the legislature in 2019. And of course, everyone remembers the 2014 shooting on Parliament Hill. So the sergeant at arms sort of looked into this and sort of came back and decided and suggested that, actually maybe within sort of the legislative precinct, some of the security guards should get weapons who didn't already have them. So that's part of this justice reform bill. The other thing on spousal and child support basically seems to, the attempt is to make it easier to collect these payments sort of across jurisdictions, across provinces and things like that. So, pretty unobjectionable, I think, in a lot of ways. And I don't have kids and haven't been divorced for that matter. So, it was surprising to me actually that that wasn't already the case. But certainly it'll be interesting to see what impact that has on folks in the months and years ahead.
Have you also heard of the talk of a potential of an early election? Or are we still headed for May of next year?
As far as I know, May of next year. Smith has sort of committed to sticking with the schedule. The issue that did sort of arise was the idea that they could sort of skip the fixed election date altogether and instead hold the election in the fall, which would sort of violate the fixed election date rules, but would be sort of legal / constitutional. But she's committed to sticking to that. The thing that is on my mind a little bit about it is where Easter falls on all of this. Easter, I think, is April 10th or 11th, and the election needs to be held on or before, I think it's May 29th, 2023. So, does it make sense to move the whole thing up earlier? Does it make sense to, run an election campaign over Easter? My thought would be no, and that you'd have sort of maybe a 6-week or a 5-week campaign after that. That makes the most sense to me. She's committed to sticking within the parameters of that, but certainly no rumbling rumors yet of, an early election or something fun like that.
And what do some of the latest poll numbers show in regards to popularity with the UCP and the NDP, and as well with their leaders, with Rachel Notley and with Premier Danielle Smith?
I haven't seen a ton of polling lately, which could just be that I've missed it. But, right out the gate, Danielle Smith was sort of trailing Rachel Notley. And that sort of, and she had a pretty rough, first week or two on the job. I would suspect that the poll numbers have sort of smoothed out slightly. But I do think that something like the Sovereignty Act, which, as I mentioned, does not have the maybe overwhelming support one might have anticipated, will sort of move those numbers around a little bit. And of course, from the NDP perspective, it's going to matter how they play this. Are they going to fall into the trap of being accused of being part of the Notley-Trudeau-Singh alliance again?
Right.
Or are they going to cast themselves as the responsible government in waiting? So there's some questions, I think, on strategy that are really going to inform some of these poll numbers in the weeks ahead. And of course, I mean, I know I'm rambling on here, but the other thing is the hospital situation, of course, and whether this government can get a grip on it, because the polling from earlier in the summer did show that things like affordability, things like healthcare were really, really top of mind for Albertans. And so that's going to be, if there's a place for Danielle Smith to make up or lose ground in the polling, it might be on some of those bread and butter issues.
Yeah, hot button election points, healthcare, education, and affordability, right? The cost of inflation. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.